In the last episode, we talked about the need for brand names. Narayan was categorical about saying that it's not a debate as much as it is a personal preference because you ultimately have to call a brand something. There is actually a brand called Nothing today. The topic of this episode is what were these companies thinking? For example, just imagine that you launch the brand, nothing gets launched today. Looks stupid, but obviously there was some pushback, or the client believed that it could be successful. And this is the person who originally started OnePlus. So it's not as if he didn't know about branding or didn't have a reason. And today there's a whole range of products which are called Nothing. I sometimes wonder what customers who buy Nothing tell their friends. What do you think they were thinking? All right.
This whole thing of irreverence is being pushed. I mean, so basically, I think we covered this issue in the previous segment that we did, where you are free to call it anything that you want as long as it's distinct. And on that grounds alone, you have to admit whatever our personal opinion might be that is distinct. There is nothing else called nothing, and therefore, in a mad way, it sort of
Something.
reminds you only of that brand rather than something else. My own feeling is that it will succeed or fail not because of its name. If they do many other things right, it could be a cult thing, but it does make you wonder. I mean, what were these guys thinking? And if nothing else, probably there's a lot of courage involved in a decision like that.
Yeah, I was thinking of Nothing launches on such and such a date, or you had to be clear about saying that the Nothing brand, because at a point when it's called Nothing and to introduce Nothing into the market, I'm wondering how the agency and the client managed to get around all the things that you discussed to begin with. Anyway, that is more of an executional detail.
Yeah, it's a
But
grammatical issue. That's all. And I think the irreverence is probably they are hoping that the younger generation will catch that there is a weird kind of a humor to it. Is probably will go over the head of somebody over 50 perhaps, and they don't care. They are seeing the merit in being that. When you really super focus on a young generation to say that that is whom I'm attracting, then it is almost imperative that you have to offend or displease or cut against the grain of a much older audience. It is necessary that if you want to super focus on one group, you must mean nothing to another older group of some kind. And somehow that makes the target group feel all the better for it. Yeah, see, these oldies don't get it. They
yeah,
won't get it. It's for us.
yeah.
Therefore, it becomes a secret subversive conversation between a certain generation and a new age brand. So my feeling is it is based on sound principles. If anything, it only leads to grammatical weirdnesses like the ones that you're pointing out. But that's okay. That's surface level, and all they're saying is, and plus they have these other words like blue, 2A, and all that kind of stuff going on in any case, because
Yeah.
obviously they're going to be coming up with this model, that model to fit this price range and that price range and all that. So everything can't be called nothing. So obviously it'll be nothing blue, nothing yellow, nothing 2A, nothing 16.4, whatever. In a very bland world, I
Yeah.
find it quite, I don't know, it's quite nice. It's okay. It's
Okay.
bold. I would say that
Really is. So the
it is odd.
difference between bold and foolish is often a very thin line. So we'll
Yeah,
see
and
which
therefore
side
it's
of
a matter
the
of opinion. Therefore, the audience gets to decide that. So
yes, yes,
perhaps the younger audience probably won't even think about it. It'll probably so smoothly fit into their world, in which there
yeah,
are, I mean, even in the 70s, 80s, there were perfumes called Poison, for example.
yes,
And
yes.
therefore, you would say, who in their right minds would call something that people spray on themselves as poison? But it works for an oddball reason that there is a thing about a contradiction is another perfume. Perfume names give away
Right.
a lot of these kind of, they really break new ground. And it's again not because of the name, but there is something about these kind of names. That whole thing about what was that? Using a devil to sell a TV, for example.
Yes,
Onida. Number who in
yes.
their right minds would think of let's devil, it's a bad guy. Therefore, there is a place for using these deliberately things because there is a subtle underlying sense of humor about it. It's not that people are stupid to call them that. They are hoping that somebody sees the lightheartedness about it. And if you're too old to get it, that's fine. It was not even meant for you, is what the brand seems to be saying. Whereas somebody much younger will think that, hey, that's cool. How nice to have to. I've got a phone called Nothing. That's damn cool. Suit yourself. So
So your
I'm just
example
saying,
of poison is spot on because until now I looked at it as because yes, it is definitely not meant for the older generation, which is looking at this and saying, what is this whole thing nothing about? And then when you spoke of poison, that brought back a very strong feeling, because I remember at the point when that perfume was launched, how strong the pushback was, and how clearly it cut through all the other names in the category, which were all talking of something ephemeral, something soft and nice and woody, and all those terms that you use to describe a perfume. And here's someone who came and said, go ahead and spray it on yourself, and calling it poisonous. And while it would be a small set of people, I think the great part of that is that most of these people would be going against the grain anyway, which is how they stand out, whether it's clothes or whether it's the kind of things they use, the kind of things they say. So Poison obviously did a wonderful job of a name that is very familiar but understood very differently in a completely different context. And I think that's where the sense came from. So when we started off with nothing, and I was saying, okay, that seems like a crazy name, but then you adjusted the whole thing by saying, okay, there was a perfume called Poison, which I had not thought of for a long time. And then all of a sudden, yeah, it makes perfect sense, because what is it that is not spoken of today, or not, if it's aimed at a younger persona, if it's aimed at a younger consumer, set of consumers, it makes sense to actually put off people who are older so that they don't even look at
Precisely. Yeah, agree.
it.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah,
that, when you're super focused on one particular group, don't be scared to offend somebody else, some other groups.
yeah,
That's fine. They won't get it. In fact, that makes this exclusive. If you don't even get that this poison has been deliberately named, and if you seriously are simple enough to think that you made a mistake naming a perfume as poison, then it's not even for you. So therefore, it builds that in thing that, if you get it, if I have to explain it to you, you're not even part of this group. It does that bit, or that's the attempt. And if sufficient people get together to form a market and they complete the communication, hopefully in your favor, you have a brand. They don't, and even if the young guy started wondering, what do you mean nothing? Then there's a problem. Then obviously it's not going to finish off. So it's a risk, like with most decisions. My feeling is
as opposed to the OnePlus, which is a very simple name when you look at it. They try
yeah,
to differentiate it with the kind of branding and stuff like that. But
yeah.
OnePlus versus Nothing, Nothing is obviously a very, very strong
Yeah.
departure.
It's a strong departure. True, absolutely
Yeah.
true.
So
I would
that
say
is,
the things that kind of stuff that you started off by saying, what were they thinking at the time? To my mind, a name like Alpenliebe, for example, comes to mind. I know that in German or Swiss or Austria and all those places,
it's apparently love of
love of the
mountains.
mountains. This love of mountains and all that. So there's a reason. In fact, it's a logical German name. It brings the something to do with the Alps. Now you sell it in every village in India, and you're making them say that 2 rupee toffee or 5 rupee toffee or whatever it is. Give me Alpenliebe. What were they thinking? Why would you? I mean, again, if we were all to get into a room, some creative people. I mean, let's sit down and think of a brand name for a milky toffee. The chances of arriving at Alpenliebe would be what? One in about 50 million or something like
Yeah.
that. Some guy who was doing German classes came up with something like that. Most likely the others would say, shut up, yeah, be serious. Let's get on with that. There's some
Yeah.
serious work to be done. Don't fool around. And life will go on that way. So that way, to the Indian ear at least, it's a mouthful. And second, it is utter nonsense because it doesn't mean anything. Of course, it solves our problem of being distinct, no doubt. You can't confuse that name with anything that you've heard. So, and therefore, probably they were banking on that. And obviously, it's such an international brand that they're not going to change it just for India's sake, perhaps. What with all
Yeah.
the things that have to go in the packaging and so on and so forth. I don't know. They seem to have done a good job, and India has been, at some level, been very generous in accepting these names. We
Yes.
probably figure out a way of saying it our way. For example,
Yes.
in the 60s and 70s, I've known people in tuck shops and corner shops, people asking for Chairman cigarettes. Chairman is the closest they came to Charminar, for example. Other brand names were twisted to suit whatever your tongue, which depending on which part of India you came from.
Yeah.
So you sort of changed the foreign name to suit whatever you were capable of saying, and then therefore that name became whatever name that. And there were brands, for example, that even taught you how to pronounce. I
Hmm.
remember when I was growing up in Chennai, there used to be a radio spot whose only job, it appeared, was to tell people Google how to pronounce. It was for a, I don't know, was it for a, it was a cold tablet or a headache tablet or something. I don't think it's there anymore. It was called Salofen, and
Okay.
in that lady who spoke in that radio spot kind of slowed it down, broke it into syllables, and said Salofen. Cellophane, and therefore, after some time, like this, some of these mad repetitive jingles just get into your head, kind of stuff. So a lot of school kids like me and all must have been on a cellophane, and maybe it was not meant for us. Maybe it was meant for a more rural audience to make sure you say
Yeah.
cellophane, cellophane. That was one thing. The more difficult ones were companies like there was a pharmaceutical company called HOECHST. People didn't know how to pronounce it. Was again some German company. They put out an interesting ad to solve the name itself. So I remember seeing in the Reader's Digest of those days little ads taken out by the company where different people are pointing to a signboard where the logo is there and in cartoon form, and different characters are saying it's hochest, it's heckist, so all those things. And then finally, one very smart guy in a suit is looking at it with a very winner smile and saying it's hexed. So basically, you created a problem, then you realize that, oh, looks like I've created a problem, and then you solved it. So in addition to your regular advertising, you had to put away a budget to say, please call me like this. So those are the ones that make you think, what were those guys thinking of when they came here or something?
And we had this principal back in school, and very imposing figure, and he was Father Shock, but it wasn't written as SCHOCK, obviously. It was SCHOCH. So,
Ah, German again.
yes.
Oh
So,
man.
Father Shock really used to send this thing of terror right round the school. And I guess at that point, when you saw this German missionary stride down the hallway, it's bad enough that if you have a figure of authority coming at you, bearing a stick or whatever. As far as he was concerned, I still remember this image because it's imprinted. We had this large assembly hall, and he'd come and pause at the doorway, which meant that he kind of filled it with that shape of the missionary Father Shock, obviously. So he stands there, and you could literally see the entire audience just, all the noise in the room would go from that high level to absolute whisper. So, yeah, names have this effect of, we started off with names and then the effect it has. So, it's obvious that in a certain context, now we are seeing it from a foreign context. Now, the Indian brand Ponvand, which is a soap, I guess if it went across to Germany and they grew big enough, the Germans would probably be trying to figure out how to pronounce this in the first place. So, you have all of these things which make a lot of sense within a regional context, within the set in which that name is generated. And sometimes when it outgrows that entire market and then becomes popular for whatever reason in various places, that's when I think the problems then crop up. I'm sure you've come across some names which mean something totally different in a different language, and which may not entirely be complementary,
Yeah, that's
right?
true. But the thing is, it's not such a big issue because Ponvandu, like I said, in Tamil, I know that it means a golden beetle or something like that. You don't need, I mean, that's a very oddball name for a soap in any case. I think outside of Tamil Nadu, it will just become a sound. Just
Yeah.
like the love of the mountains, Alpenliebe, means something to the Germans, Austrians, and Swiss, just becomes a sound here. You're just saying that thing over there in that thing, I want five of those. What's it called? Alpenliebe. That's all. It becomes some sounds to say, just like Horlicks becomes a sound at some point, and everything else, all the brand names without any specific meaning, or it means something in some other language, becomes a sound. It is just that sometimes, like with Hext, the sounds are complicated that they have to put away money to spend to say, please pronounce my name like this. That is one part. The other
Yeah.
part, which is no longer very prevalent these days, but used to be common in the 80s and 90s and probably earlier, used to be that suddenly successful brands used to just change their names overnight, and international brands at that. I remember campaigns being done for a color film. I mean, when people still used cameras with a 35 film inside them, as against this digital thing that we carry in our phones. There was a film company called Sakura, and Japanese, obviously, and they changed their name to Konica. And there was a huge campaign done just saying, something as Sakura is now Konica. So it was there on TV, or not maybe TV, just during cinema days. It was certainly on radio, and there were enough number of print ads, and there were regional ads, and lots of print ads, just to make sure when you see this new name, don't think that it's a new name. It's your regular Sakura. Just the name is changed changed. Quality is the same. The company is the same. We're all the same. And they had to reassure a lot of
Somehow,
people.
I just recall this because there was this point. I remember an ad from that series where there is this guy who goes onto the mountains and yells Sakura, and the word Konica comes back.
Oh, okay. Smart. Okay. Nice. I'm bringing it up just to say that some brands, sort of in addition to the problems in the marketplace that every brand has to face, they tied themselves in knots themselves and then said, suddenly, let's change this name, which is very famous, very successful, and it's made millions of dollars for us. Hey, how about changing our name for whatever reason? I mean, in retrospect, it feels like, why would you do something like this? Like some Google suddenly saying, let's change our name to something. I don't think this was an exception or something like that. It seemed to have been common. Many brands, Indian and whatnot. Nissan, it used to be known as Datsun. Again, Japanese for some reason. Datsun suddenly changed its name to Nissan. And now, of course, for the last 20, 30 years, we just know it as
It
Nissan. But
is Nissan.
oh,
Yes. Yes.
Datsun, both the company and the brand and the line of cars were all called Datsun year after year after year to make sure that against all competition, you are remembered, you are respected, you are known for this promise and all that. And suddenly somebody comes along and says, hey, why don't we change not just the campaign, but the name itself? That's probably drives the question, what were they thinking? And you really don't know. Maybe the management changed hands, so God knows what it was.
Yeah.
Sometimes in a country like India with what 27, 30, 32, whatever number of languages and all that, our country has a special problem when it comes to brand names, and you sometimes have to wonder what were those guys thinking, because of most of the advertising, especially in the 80s and 90s, used to come out of Bombay. All the other cities had kind of the so-called branches and all that, and therefore you needed to be very, very careful about what some words might mean in a local language. Although this is not a brand name, I've heard it said, this is not during my time, it probably in the
Okay.
70s or maybe even earlier. Again, one of my seniors has mentioned in a hilarious context that there was this toothpaste. If I remember right, it was a toothpaste called Colinos,
Yeah.
probably an American
Right.
brand or something. Apparently, it was good for the gums or being promoted as being good for the gums. And therefore, they had this hoarding line and print ads that they'd taken out in English called Colinos, the soothpaste. Now, especially you're from Chennai and from Tamil Nadu, so you'll get it.
You know
A
what?
very awful thing to say, and for people outside of Tamil Nadu, it's a very crude way of saying you're behind, or it's a very cuss word kind of a level, gutter
Exactly.
language for the word sooth. I'm hesitating to say it because in English it means the opposite. It's quite comforting. In Tamil, it's an awful word use, and suddenly I can imagine. I wasn't there when it happened, but it's hearsay. But if and when it happened, it must have been quite a stir for so many Chennaites or Madrasis as wake up
To see
one
it
morning and see
in
their
giant,
these
in the
hoardings,
giant
giant
body.
billboards all over saying Colinos the toothpaste. And people must have stifled laughter, or the older people might have been offended. I don't know what the reaction must have been. Some people may have wondered, is it a cream for hemorrhoids or something like that? And could they have said it better? Or, yeah, now therefore, these days, or at least the last 20, 25 years, we do a check, especially when it
Yes.
comes to brand. I mean, this is
Yes.
not so much a brand name, as it is more like a descriptor or an
Yeah.
advertising
More of,
headline.
yeah.
The
Yeah.
same principle holds true that your pun wonder, for example, the example that you're giving, could mean something awful in German or something, God knows. Then, you really want to check that out before you do thrust your brand name out to the
Yeah.
external world.
You
And so, from your
put your
comfort
billions
zone of
into it.
it meaning something to some particular audience, and you go somewhere. I mean, obviously, that Colinos example was that's probably one thing where you are led to think, what were those guys thinking? Couldn't they have done a simple test before releasing something like this?
So we'll leave it there, Narayan. I think we've covered good ground. Like, subscribe, and share. Join in the conversation. We'd be glad to hear from you. Thank you, guys. We'll see you around.
Bye.